All right, hello and welcome everyone to Politics and Prose Live. My name is Bashan. I am with the event staff, Politics and Prose. Before we get started, just want to go over a couple quick items. The first being that we asked that if anyone would like to ask any questions of the author, you would direct them to the Q&A box, if you would, which you can find towards the bottom of your screen, just to help us keep everything categorized. The second is that at any time during this event, you can go to the chat section and you can use the link to purchase a copy of Homeland Elegies directly from the Politics and Prose website, which of course it would be greatly appreciated and highly encouraged. That said, would like to welcome this evening Ayad Akhtar. Ayad is the author of American Dervish, which was published in over 20 languages and named the Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2012. As a playwright, he has written plays such as Junk, Disgraced, The Who and the What, and The Invisible Hand. As a screenwriter, he was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award for Best Screenplay for The War Within. He is joined this evening by Evan Osnos. Evan is a staff writer at The New Yorker and a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Based in Washington, D.C., he writes about foreign affairs and politics. He himself is the author of Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China, which won the 2014 National Book Award. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bashan, and nice to see you here, my friend Ayad. How are you?
You, Evan. I'm good. I'm
good. I'm going to embarrass you here.
Just work on the background.
Yes, exactly. We're all working on our backgrounds in the Zoom era.
Yeah.
I'm going to embarrass you here at the outset with just a bit of introduction for folks who are tuning in. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for signing on. As you know, we're here to talk about a really extraordinary novel, Homeland Elegies, which I am going to give you the highest form of praise here by showing you the notes that are in this book, the ones that my kids have not pulled out, but my kids tend to go after my Post-it notes. But the Washington Post, as some of you in the audience will have read, said of this book that it would not surprise if it wins a second Pulitzer Prize. We have an hour together, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk up here, the two of us, for a little while, and then we'll open it up for questions, which you can add in the Q&A. But before we plunge in, I want to say a few words about the man you've come to see, the novelist, playwright, actor, and highly productive obsessive, Ayad Akhtar, as I think of him. This week, I'm pleased to say that my colleague at The New Yorker, Alexandra Schwartz, published a profile that will give you a sense of Ayad's life and work and how they've been intertwined. As many of you know, Ayad grew up in Wisconsin in a Pakistani-American family. And early on, he developed a capacity to plunge headlong, consumingly into his subjects. When he was studying at Brown, he fell so in love with the theater that he skipped his own graduation to fly to Italy to study with Jerzy Grotowski, the avant-garde Polish director, who worked his actors for 16 hours at a time, sometimes until dawn. Later, Ayad enrolled in film school at Columbia, and in his first semester, he directed 12 shorts, one film a week, which is a kind of lunatic sprint. Years later, in a single month, in January 2012, he published his first novel, American Dervish, and premiered his first play, Disgraced. And as many of you will know, that became a sensation, and it won him the Pulitzer Prize. Since then, he has premiered at least 3 more plays, including The Invisible Hand, which is a thriller about an American hostage in Pakistan who pays his ransom by teaching his captors how to manipulate financial markets. And also Junk, which I'm pleased to say managed to turn the subject of junk bonds in the 1980s into a riveting Broadway hit, which is an achievement up there with turning Hamilton into a Broadway hit. Over and over, what we see is that he has produced work that manages to be both, I think, deeply intellectual, but also never inaccessible. And he takes these very complex systems and makes them viscerally, intimately interesting. As Ayad put it in the New Yorker, he aims for the intersection of where Proust meets Jerry Springer, which I think in the context of this meeting means, Ayad, that you get to be Proust and I'll be Jerry Springer for this occasion.
Okay.
So I want to start us off here. I want to give our audience a sense of this book. So I think it would be great if we would start with a reading. And you and I talked about starting on page 23. And I'll leave it.
Should I give a little context of it?
Please. Yeah.
So the first chapter of the book is, thank you, Evan. It's a real delight to be with you, not in person, unfortunately, but over the computer. So the first chapter of the book tells the story of my father's support of Donald Trump during the narrator's father's support of Donald Trump during the 2016 election, and which is predicated on a story that I tell of time in the mid-90s when he was part of Donald Trump's medical team studying arrhythmias, some arrhythmias that Trump at the time in the book was having trouble with. And so my father's involved and gets to know Trump and has a kind of crush on him in a way, a kind of bromance bit. You know, not that he spends a lot of time around Trump, but he's sort of enamored with this lifestyle. And he kind of falls in love, if you will, with the ersatz, the ersatz glamour. And that becomes the occasion of sort of him feeling he knows Trump, the candidate, better than the pundits do during the 2016 election, and that they're all stooges in the Republican Party, and Trump's the only one who's speaking the truth. And he recognizes the man he knows. And we get into all kinds of stuff over this because I'm appalled, especially after the Muslim ban. I can't believe that my narrator can't believe that his father would do these things, would say these things, would want to support Trump. So anyway, the night of the election or the day of the election, he and I speak on the phone, and he won't admit whether or not he's voted for Trump, but it sounds pretty clear like he did. It sounds pretty clearly like he did. And so I have this final section toward the end of the chapter where I try to explain what was it about Trump that I'm trying to understand it. So I think Father was looking for an image of just how much more his American self could contain than the Pakistani one he'd left behind. I think he wanted to know what the limits were. In America, you could have everything, right? Even the presidency. If an idiot like Trump could get a hold of it, couldn't you? Even if you didn't want it? After all, the idiot apparently didn't want it either. He just wanted to know he could have it. Or maybe the emphasis there needs to shift. He wanted to know he could have it. Yes, I think that's right. Elsewhere, I've referred to Trump's ascendancy as the completion of the long-planned advent of the merchant class to the sanctum sanctorum of American power, the conquering rise of mercantilism with all its attendant vulgarity, its acquisitive conscience supplanting every moral one, an event in our political life that signals the collapse not of democracy, which has in truth enabled it, but of every bulwark against wealth as holy pursuit, which appears to be the last American passion left standing. De Tocqueville would not be surprised. My father is no exception. Trump is just the name of his story.
Well, we are going to talk tonight about a number of the features of that passage, particularly wealth as holy pursuit. But it's helpful, I think, for readers to know that is the end of the first chapter, which is a kind of a structurally significant moment in a book, signaling some of the things that are on your mind. I want to address just briefly at the outset one of the things that's interesting and distinctive about the book, which is it is a novel. You're very clear about that. It is a novel about a man named Ayad Akhtar, who is a playwright who won a Pulitzer Prize, who grew up in Wisconsin, and so on. You're playing throughout with this permeable distinction, never announced, never clarified about what's real and what's false. Why does that feel like a particularly contemporary form of play? Because it feels that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to answer that question. You know, there's the organic way, which is to say that a voice emerged out of me, if you will, and I started to follow that voice. And that voice was trying to address the part of me that was addicted to the breaking news notification and the Instagram scroll feed. And I wanted to break out of that, if you will, or I wanted to break into it. I wanted to find a way to capture that level of attention and interest, because I myself had lost the ability to some extent to be as interested in the straightforward third person narrative, fictional narrative, or clearly fictional. And in my hands, I knew that that traditional way of writing fiction I was not going to be able to get my head, my language, my heart around the contemporary political reality. It seemed to me that if I was to write that sort of a book, it was going to feel like satire. And the way to correct for satire was to pivot into memoir, was to pivot into this game where it's not clear what's real and what's not real, and in a way to mirror, not even in a way, I mean consciously, to try to have a texture to the book that mirrored the reality we're living in, where truth and fiction have collapsed into each other. I wanted to get into that prurient, sensational, I say Proust meets Jerry Springer, right? And I wanted to have developed language, and I wanted to think interesting things, and I wanted to say things that were potentially, wide-ranging and connected. But I also wanted to make sure that the reader, page to page, felt like they had to turn the page.
And there is something about this period in which we are all surrounded by unreality to such a point that it is, we almost don't even remark on it. I mean, in the span of even the last few years, it's become such a fact of our being. I'm interested in this question of the American fondness for that unreality. I mean, Kurt Anderson wrote a book I remember called Fantasyland about this sort of persistent fascination that we have with the sort of tantalizingly unreal, Donald Trump being the ultimate outgrowth of that. How much do you see this as a modern phenomenon, and how much do you see this as a permanent feature, the American berserk, as Philip Roth called it?
Right. That's a good question. I don't know that I think I was so appalled. In a way, the book emerges from a kind of a shuddering awakening to the collapse of a vision of America that I think my parents had. They came over in the late 60s and had an idea of what this country was and why they were here. And in the 50 years that they lived here, the country changed so much. And I, growing up, was always caught between what they thought the country was and what I was discovering the country was. I mean, I wrote this play, which you mentioned, or which was mentioned in the introduction, called Junk, about debt financing. And in a way, the real reason I sort of wrote the play was to try to understand what happened. How did appearance become a substitute for reality? It may turn out that appearance has always been a substitute for reality in American life. But for me, there was a reality, and then I started to realize, no, appearance was much, much more important. So it's a good question. I don't feel qualified to answer whether it's an innately American phenomenon or whether it's something that just happened in the last 50 years.
Well, one of the things that I love in the book, and you're touching on this now, partly this was what you were getting at with Junk, is that you've circled around in a number of projects the role of capitalism in America in life, and the sort of distorting effects of wealth as an end state, as a goal, as a sort of spiritual path almost for Americans. Because this book operates on multiple levels. There is a story of immigrants and their children. There's a story of fathers and sons and mothers and sons. And then there is, running through it, this story of money. And at one point, actually, when I was sort of thinking about this, I did a word search in the book because I was kind of curious. And you might be surprised to discover that the word money appears almost as much as the word Muslim in the book. It's almost equal. Oh
my God, that's brilliant.
So this is like the metadata of your mind coming through.
Oh my God, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Why do you think, here you are, you're a playwright and a novelist. You could have gone in, you could be running your own hedge fund now. Why are you interested in money as a matter of art?
Well, I think it's the untold, actually, the untold American story. I feel like what we're dealing with now, the sort of crumbling of the republic, if you will, to put it in highfalutin terms, has to do with substantial changes to the legislation and the thinking around what value is in American life. I mean, we have valorized the process of pulling apart and selling off our national infrastructure for the sake of individual benefit. And that sort of rampant individualism enshrined into, really financial plunder of the collective is, I think, at root why in this pandemic, none of our systems are really working. I think the issue of individual rights and racial rights is really, really, really important. But the real story of how the country has come apart is an economic story. It's not actually a story about exclusion.
Yeah.
In a racial or identity sort of way.
Mm-hmm. But, at the end of his life, King, of course, was talking about the intersection of race and economics. I think I'll paraphrase terribly, but his line was, what good is it for me to be able to eat at the lunch counter if I don't have the money in my pocket to be able to buy anything? And so there is that sense that economic injustice runs in this interwoven way through the issues.
And Ford, Ford, love him or hate him, and there's lots of reasons to hate him, but Henry Ford said it about as well as anybody could. If you can't pay your workers enough to buy the cars that they make, you have a long-term structural problem. Mm-hmm. We are 50 years into a long-term structural problem, and we're not going to get out of it without thinking seriously about our relationship to money as Americans. So that's really why Muslim and money are the two things that predominate throughout the book.
You've got a character in the book who has a great line, fascinating line at one point. You describe one of your characters as believing that the arc of history does indeed bend towards justice, but he defines justice as the will of the strong borne by the weak, and those who own are the strong. It's a kind of, I found it's sort of a merger of these two notions of what we are as Americans. Are we this country that is aspiring towards a greater sense of justice, or are we a country that is aspiring towards a greater sense of ownership? And he more or less fuses them in that idea.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that's been interesting sort of to observe, and maybe a coming of age intellectually for me as an American, but also just as a thinker or as an artist, is to recognize that property has its own point of view. And that when you start to own, your ideas change. And it's a lot of people say, folks who have money, they don't have compassion. And that generally tends to be true, that as you get wealthier, you seem to have less, one seems to have less and less compassion for others. And again, there's reasons for this. It speaks to a deep sort of division between conservatives and progressives, where the conservative mindset is really about holding on to what you have. Mm-hmm. And the progressive mindset is about the disaggregation of wealth from those who do have it. And that eternal battle is the battle of society in some ways. I'm not trying to come down on one side or the other. They are the polarities that make a healthy society. But I think in our case, we have legislated the accumulation of capital in such a way that it has made it we can't disaggregate it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how we're going to undo that problem.
What you're describing, which is this kind of all-encompassing market faith that has become an unquestioned fact, certainly of establishment America. And really, sure. I came to think of it as I was reading the book. I was struck by the similarity between the zealotry that surrounds market faith and zealotry of other kinds, in the sense that they are all immune to questioning. If you go to a certain kind of dinner party in New York City and you say, look, I'm not altogether convinced that shareholder value is paramount, that's a form of heresy. And it's a form of heresy that makes people very uncomfortable at the table. Do you think that's changing now?
Well, it's interesting because the last time we were in each other's presence was at one of those, right, in one of those rooms, somebody very fabulously wealthy. And you and he were talking about shareholder rights finally being something that needs to be questioned. I mean, at what point did it become sacrosanct that the only stakeholders of interest in a company's well-being are its shareholders? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a bizarre aberration that makes no sense, but that then creates incentives where our entire economy depends on companies whose entire existence is centered on increasing market capitalization.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can talk about this thing all day. So I won't monopolize your book on that, because you have a fabulous character, one of the ones that I know a lot of people are responding to, who is Riaz Rind. And rather than me try to describe him, who is Riaz Rind?
So one of the things that happens in the book is that, you know, this writer who has my name and many of the facts of my life, and is struggling quite a bit. His parents are confused. Why is he writing? And they're both doctors, but they're at each other's throats in different ways, and everybody's trying to figure out how to get by. But this writer ends up sort of deciding after a series of encounters in Scranton over one 24-hour period that he's no longer going to pretend that he feels American, even though he is American, born in America, and begins to write some works based on this epiphany, if you will. That leads to him writing a play that results in him winning a Pulitzer. Not too dissimilar from what happened to me. And winning the Pulitzer suddenly elevates him into a different echelon of society. And he is approached by a hedge fund manager who is a guy named Riaz Rind, who has a philanthropic outfit that's about changing the conversation about Islam in America. He wants to make Muslim lives better, and he wants to change the ideas that people have about Islam. He's also in pursuit of his first $1 billion, right? And the narrator kind of becomes enamored or seduced by the lifestyle as he spends more and more time around this guy, Riaz Rind, and he joins the board of the philanthropic organization, joins the executive committee, starts traveling the world as a kind of show pony. You know, Riaz, the financier, has this Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and there's a whole song and dance that goes on. And what ends up happening, and I won't give it away, but because of his proximity to Riaz Rind, not only does the narrator become wealthier than he has any right to imagine that he could be through a fortuitous, weird thing that happens, but he also comes to embody, I think, some of the worst tendencies of what, you know, is now being called a kind of neoliberal success, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. Enlightened political consciousness married to limitless wealth. Mm-hmm. And the book is trying to, I wouldn't say skewer that, but it's trying to put a magnifying glass to that vision of believing that the American dream could somehow redeem, that my success as an individual can somehow redeem the disrepair that the country has fallen into. Because to me, that's the fundamental conflict, is between our individual franchise and our lack of a meaningful understanding of what a collective good could be for us anymore.
You know, the Rind character reminded me very much, in the best way, of a Gatsby character, and I think, you know, the New York Times mentioned that, and partly because of the way you describe him as almost physically indistinct. He's almost a little bit hard for us. There's something, he sort of slips through your fingers. He's poised, but also there's something going on. There's turmoil there that you kind of unravel as we move deeper in, and we eventually begin to understand some of the sources of that. But what I found interesting as I was thinking about him as a sort of Gatsby for now is, you know, what did Fitzgerald tell us? It was that the rich, they smash things up and then they walk away. That was, I'm paraphrasing, as long as I'm, you know, misquoting King, I can misquote Fitzgerald as well. But that was that's the iconic expression of what was the sort of that heedless Gilded Age ethic. It was the idea that on an individual basis, you can drive your car into somebody and get away with it. And right. What you've captured here is that on the scale of private equity or of hedge funds, which is you can go into an industry or go into a town and move the pieces around as somebody who has that sort of power. And ultimately, you can be secluded from the consequences, or at least you think you're secluded from the consequences. And what I find interesting about this moment is that it feels as if those consequences are sort of bubbling to the surface in every possible way.
I hope you're right. I really hope you're right. It seems to me the system may be capable of somatizing and digesting all of this as well. I worry about that. But it's interesting. I mean, when you talk about private equity, you know, in doing the research for that section of the book, I looked into a couple of stories, and one of them had to do with a glass manufacturer, which was sold and sold and sold so many times that nobody could figure out who owned it anymore. Yeah. And the people who were running the company had no understanding of how glass was made, had no interest in, you know, furnace safety regulations. There was no connection between those who owned and those who made.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me like a deeper metaphor for what's happened to the American economy and the American nation in the era of finance.
Yeah. Yeah. What you just captured is that sense of that when things are reduced essentially to their arithmetic meaning, and that's it, it's just the numbers on the page, it becomes very easy to lose sight of what the impact is. You have another character I want to mention who I thought was also fascinating. He makes only a brief appearance, and this is I'm probably mispronouncing his first name, Daniel Ramin, who was a classmate, if I have it right. And tell us who he is and why he's in there.
It's funny, I had wanted to possibly read that section to you. So I'm thinking maybe I'll just read it because it might be interesting. So, the example of my friend Daniel Ramin had haunted me for years. Daniel was likely the most extravagantly talented of my college classmates, a theater artist who'd studied in Vermont with the Bread and Puppet Troupe before starting his own group in Brooklyn, a visionary designer and director whose arresting shows went up at the public and were invited to Avignon and Salzburg, a singular voice hailed by critics as a new world heir to Tadeusz Kantor, and a man who'd gone for much of his adult life without health insurance. He got married, had a child, the pregnancy was covered by Medicaid, and so was the new family until they weren't. When Daniel was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder, well, you can probably guess the rest of the story. Its entropic denouement, by now as much a staple of American life as apple pie. A well-meaning crowdsourced appeal online raised enough money to keep the wolf from the door, but only for so long. Treatment was expensive. The medications alone ran into the hundreds of thousands, but his parents found the money. He survived. His theater company didn't. Neither did his marriage. Last I heard, he'd moved back home to North Carolina where he was working at a Starbucks. At least the job gave him benefits. A once-in-a-generation talent, mind you, making double-shot, extra wet lattes for realtors on their bathroom breaks between appointments.
What I find amazing about what you've captured there is the Prokaryote, the realm of American life for whom the outcome of their life, as compared to yours or the character of Akhtar in the book, it's forks.
Who has much greater net worth than mine.
Exactly. Yours is in the high two figures, but you've got promise. I think, do you think that, what I find wonderfully interesting about that character is that the Ayad character in the book is self-conscious about finding himself in that world of being the show pony with the billionaire or the almost billionaire, and finding that you can't finish the play because you're at George Clooney's house, and it's hard to focus when you're at George Clooney's. And so there's that incredible. Yes, exactly, and that sort of the sense that you are only on that sense of precariousness of its own, by which you don't really want to lose what you've acquired. Do you think that, I know that is a real thing, that thing.
Property has its point of view. When you begin to own, your ideas change. Mm-hmm. And it changes your political consciousness, and it changes your relationship to the world. And I wanted to show that process. I think that it's complicated. I often say that the problem with our relationship to capitalism is that it's really easy to criticize capitalism, and it's even easier to enjoy its benefits. Mm-hmm. And that's the dilemma that we're in, because we're destroying our society, we're destroying ourselves, we're destroying the planet, but we're enjoying ourselves a lot in the process. Mm-hmm. So how do we get out of that cycle? And obviously the book is a novel, it's a story. It throws the reader, and I was thrown into these ideas, these oppositions, these possibilities, these registers of frequency or these vibrancies, but I don't have a solution to any of that, obviously.
Well, what you do show us, though, is what happens when systems blow up. And one of the things that I find, there is in some ways, the analog, the other side of Riaz Rin's story is the father's story. This is a man who believed in the American dream. He built his own sort of mini Trumpian experience. And then it all comes unraveled. And it comes unraveled partly because of the intervention of some keen-eyed MBAs. Remind people who haven't read it yet, what happens in that? What are you describing about that? The life of a doctor whose practice gets bought essentially for free.
Right. So the narrative that you're talking about is my father, who is an academic cardiologist, but opens private practice, and then it goes belly up, and then starts another private practice. And late in the book, there's a very, very long chapter. It's about 100 pages about a court case, a malpractice lawsuit that toward the end of his career, the narrator's father gets wrapped up in. He's a cardiologist who diagnoses a problem with a 26-year-old pregnant young woman and suggests she get off some medication. And when he suggests that, she ends up dying 2 weeks later, and then he finds himself in court, and he's battling for his reputation. And what ends up happening is the sort of larger story of what happened between this patient and the narrator's father in the exam room is really a microcosm of how healthcare has completely changed, and how the idea of the administrative idea of reducing the amount of time that doctors spend with patients to maximize the number of visits that can be logged in a given day, to increasingly outsource a lot of the care to registered nurses, that the entire infrastructure of how to think about decision-making, even diagnostically, within healthcare has been completely changed by folks who have MBAs and don't have MDs. Mm-hmm. People who have no contact with patients, and for whom every aspect of healthcare is really just a line item on a spreadsheet, and that there is no real nuance except at the end what the bottom line shows. Mm-hmm. And so that's the story that, the father's reputation and his experience in America as an American, litigated in a court of his fellow citizens in Western Wisconsin in a rural town, really comes down to the fact that he has been powerless to stay a doctor who cares about patients.
I want to talk about Wisconsin because it plays an interesting role in the book and in your life. You grew up there.
Yeah.
What part of Wisconsin did you grow up in? Was it
rural? I grew up in Waukesha County, which is just outside of Milwaukee, and deep red. But I wouldn't have known red versus blue when I was growing up. Good, smart people, and very accepting and welcoming. Now it's changed a lot. Scott Walker changed the texture of life in Wisconsin in some very significant way.
In what way? So not just at the political level, but you feel it in the sort of fabric of day-to-day life?
Absolutely. A kind of a suspicion of outsiders, a contempt for, really for liberals. It's a microcosm of what's happened across the country, where these weird tribal hostility that seems to have emerged almost from nowhere. And I can understand, for example, folks who live in the rural areas whose dairy farms are going out of business, who don't have any money, that come into the cities and they see the wealth in the cities, and I can understand that animosity. I can understand the animosity that folks in Wisconsin have for the people on the coasts, the ways in which businesses, when they get up and running, like LaCroix, sparkling water, which started in La Crosse, Wisconsin, but now is in Florida because it's better for the owner's tax bill. That sort of movement of capital, both human and monetary, out of the heartland for the coast. I can understand those animosities. Some of these the liberal conservative ideology it just doesn't make sense anymore. At least in Wisconsin, it doesn't track against people's interest. It often doesn't even track against cultural issues. It really is just this marker that, that's them. So that's something that's happened really since Scott Walker. And I think Wisconsin was a testing ground for a lot of, whether it's the Heritage Foundation or whether it was, the Koch brothers or whatever. I think it was a petri dish, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that, of course, it becomes refracted through the overlapping lens of the post 9/11 era. And, a lot of us spend our times trying to disentangle these threads and say how much of this is about economics and how much of this is about fear and discomfort with immigration, with people of color, with race.
Right.
And how does that look to you as you look to this place?
Well, it's so interesting, Evan. You talk about that. I have friends who run businesses in Wisconsin, right? and a business in Kenosha, for example, where Jacob Blake was just, the whole episode with Jacob Blake. And, they'll say stuff like, there's a lot of jobs, but the locals don't want those jobs. They don't want those jobs because either they don't pay as much, or they are jobs that there's just no interest for locals to be doing that. So immigrants have been coming in, and we need to hire folks for those jobs. Mm-hmm. So even that aspect of the picture is so complex, because the jobs are there for folks. It's not as if the immigrants are taking those jobs away.
Yeah.
It's hard to, the interesting thing for me about the portrait of Wisconsin that I was able to sort of attempt in the book is that all of the complexities, I wanted all of these things to sort of coexist without necessarily drawing some larger conclusion about it, because it seems to me that they're all symptoms of a deeper malaise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and you don't draw a tidy sort of simple conclusion, because that's not how the reality is. And you have there, without giving away some key parts of the book, there are moments when these threads kind of come together, whether it's guns and hostility towards a Pakistani family. All of these moments become very acute. And there's one character that I find fascinating in here, also a minor character. I seem to be attracted to some of.
No, it's great. It's great. No, your reading is wonderful.
Well, you've got a cop named Benji, and Benji is kind. He is kind to the family in the novel. Almost one of the sort of rare kind people in the book, right? And
yeah.
What's Benji about? I honestly, you want to know what I really thought I had? I wanted to know if Benji voted for Trump in 2016. I kept wondering.
It's so interesting because he is fascinated by the fact that the narrator's father was Trump's doctor. So in that section, father ends up in jail because he's at a casino and he gets really drunk, and Benji's there. And I, and Akhtar in the book, went to high school with Benji. Benji's now a deputy in the local police department. And so his wife is a dealer at the local casino, and he sees my dad there kind of drunk, well, very drunk, walking out of the parking lot to get into his car. And Benji stops him, won't let him get in the car, puts him in the squad car and sticks him in jail where he falls asleep. And so then I come and pick him up. But yes, there's a whole episode around Benji, and yeah, Benji probably voted for Trump.
Which is fascinating because Benji's also the kind of guy who's willing to take the trip into the city to go see the play. Like
but which he wasn't totally on board though.
That's true. But what I thought was what was important about this idea was you're able to sort of take these small peripheral figures and invest them with real meaning, with complex valences. It's not like there's a simple villain or a simple hero. And
that's what happens. That's what happens when your template is, or when you're, is real life. You know, the beginning of the book, the epigraph at the beginning is from Alison Bechdel. It says, I can only make things up about things that have already happened. There's a level of specificity that can only come from real life.
Well, talk to us about your process, because I think your process is quite rigorous. I mean, you take a lot of notes on real life. Do you carry a notebook with you?
I do. It depends on the period. There'll be times when I'm writing a lot about what's happening day to day, and I'm just sort of making notes. It's something I remember sort of spending a lot of time reading Philip Roth and sort of beginning to pick apart what his process was. You know, really hours a day of note taking, just to sort of get the details right.
Yeah.
Because the magic is in the details. But yes, with this book, there was a lot of note taking. In
a minute, we're going to open this up to questions in just a second. But on that, I think there's probably a lot of writers who tune into an event like this and would be curious to know more about your note-taking. Do you do it at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day? Do you have a formalized process, or do you just sort of jot down what occurs to you?
When I'm at my best, I have a regular time that I'm able to do it. And sometimes I'll try to do it in the evening, but then if I can do it the next morning, it's fine. It's so interesting because I will remember the day. I'll remember almost very, very minute aspects of the day as long as I'm close enough to the previous day, whether it just happened earlier that day or just the next day. And then just logging it somehow stays. I don't even necessarily need to consult the notes again.
Mm-hmm. All right, I have to take questions here as much as I'd like to keep asking them myself. We have a question from A questioner asks, Asha is a version of Muslim women we don't often hear about in contemporary literature. Can you tell us about her, please?
Yeah. So Asha is a woman that my narrator falls in love with, if you will. I mean, he gets syphilis from, I mean, the chapter begins by announcing that he had a period where he had a lot of unprotected sex, and that the person he least expected to get syphilis from was Asha. And so this is the introduction to Asha, who is a Texas-born lawyer who's now working at Aramco at the oil services, the Saudi oil services company. And because of the narrator's access to people with money, and because of his association with Riaz Rind and his association with the board, he ends up meeting her at the Harvard Club at an event. And they have a really kind of magical evening. And, they have a one-night stand, and that leads to a kind of on-again, off-again relationship that's very contemporary, if you will. But what's interesting about all of it is that, at least I guess to some readers, is that she's still caught between notions of American identity and still holding on to notions of her Muslim or her parents' Muslim or Pakistani identity. And so those things sit untidily in different ways, as they do for the narrator. The narrator is never really able to make peace with all of these contradictions, and neither is she. And she has a boyfriend who's a basketball player who's now selling cars. And he's a white guy who played in Latvia and then came back to Houston, and they've been together on again, off again. And over the course of the relationship the narrator has with Asha, who's really just a wonderful person and a beautiful, beautiful woman, she ends up breaking up with the narrator, and that leads to all kinds of consequences. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it gives you a little bit of context.
Well, you situated her at this intersection of American life and Pakistani identity, and its complex character. I want to do two things.
She's very much like a lot of folks that I've grown up with, like myself.
I want to remind people two things. One, there's a link to buy the book in the chat. This is an important time to buy books because the virtual life is not as good for authors as the in-store life. I can't say that himself, but I can for him. I want to read a question here from another great author, Barbara Demick, who is the author of Eat the Buddha, which is worth everybody's attention about Tibet. And she asks, did you ever consider doing this book as nonfiction?
I didn't. There would be no way to pull it off. I'm a dramatist first and foremost, and the kind of compression that I require, and the sort of sharp narrative edges and the twists and turns of the story, moving on, hairpin, and just the velocity, I just have to fictionalize. I have to find ways, and also opposition. I mean, to me, the fundamental principle of drama is opposition, is two opposites coexisting and moving from one pole to the other. A rich character becomes poor, a poor character becomes rich. That movement for me as a dramatic storyteller is the central movement of stories. And so I can't do that if I have to just report what actually happened. What actually happened is so much more boring.
Yeah.
It would require a sort of 30-year gaze, and you could compress 30 years of events into a story that would keep the reader's attention. At least in my hands. But
you also feel this clear sort of fidelity to the technical facts. I mean, when you give a description of Robert Bork's view on antitrust policy, it's actually Robert Bork's view. So what is it? You're sort of seduced by the endless sort of interestingness of reality, but in order to make it serve story, you have to steer it.
Yeah, because I'm not a specialist of antitrust litigation. So if I'm going to talk about why the growing scale of American corporations has hollowed out American life, I've got to find a compelling narrative way to get me into that. Mm-hmm. And then if I do that, then I have a little space here and there to dwell on the details. It's a thing that Alexandra talks about in the profile, that Daniel Kahneman for me is a really, really interesting figure, because he and Amos Tversky demonstrated that that you can only work for about 2.5 minutes before you shut off. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to have the viewer's attention, at least as a playwright, you've got to continually build these pockets of release, whether it's laughter or pause or relaxation, before you can begin again. And so inside those pockets, sometimes just moving into a different frequency is enough of a shift to make a reader feel like they're not working anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, this book does have, I mean, in sort of musical terms, you go to the bridge occasionally, you like slip into a totally different octave, come back. I'm intrigued to hear that's partly you're mindful of where the audience is and their rhythms. And where
totally. If I'm losing interest as I'm writing or as I'm reading it over again, if I'm losing interest and I wrote it, clearly the reader is going to lose interest.
Did this book change a lot in the writing? I mean, was this another form at one point and you moved it around?
Not significantly. I did a first draft that was, I think, about 120,000 words, and then I cut 10,000 or 12,000 words out of it in the second draft. It substantially came out of me in the order that it exists on the page. There was maybe one section that was out of order that I moved. But for the most part, no, it was just beginning to end.
Did you know how it was going to end when you started it?
I knew that the final section would be a combination of a expansive portrait of Wisconsin as a metaphor for America, that on which the central thread of that story was going to be the narrator's father's experience as an American being judged by a court of his fellow citizens in rural Wisconsin. I knew that was going to be the central dramatic note, and I needed to get there somehow.
I won't give away what happens in the trial, but well, I can't ask the question without giving it away. But I do.
They're unexpected. I didn't know how the trial would end, because the real trial did end one particular way, and it felt like, again, it wasn't serving the purposes. Mm-hmm. And so the ending, I wasn't sure what the ending would be, and then one day, it came to me. Oh, okay. And a lot of times these twists, like, for example, there's a big twist in the Riaz section about the finance. It's a huge twist that it just came to me one day. I was writing and it's, oh, wow, this is what happens. This is what he does.
Do you write in the morning? Do you write at night?
Yeah. But usually between 9 and 2. I'm really not any good after 2 o'clock. I can't even believe I'm stringing together a sentence at 8:45 here. I mean. And
I've read that you start every day by reading a Shakespeare sonnet. Is that just when you're writing, or
that really made me look like a weirdo?
Pretty fancy, I have to say. It's, in our house we start the day by reading Little Blue Truck or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's nobody better in my experience. There's nobody better to get that intellectual and emotional static of language moving through the mind than Shakespeare, and the way that sound and meaning are both divorced and married from line to line, and his ability to move through metaphor. I mean, just every morning I try to, spend half an hour just kind of warming up. It's the way to get my mind warmed up.
100%. I totally agree. And I think the fact, because you're a playwright, that's one of the reasons why you're reading Shakespeare in the morning. Whereas, other people will read nonfiction or what have you.
Yeah.
I have a question here. I definitely don't want to miss, and I have more of my own here, but we have a question from Imtiaz Akhtar, who asks, I don't know if it's a relation or not, but
there is an Imtiaz in the book.
Well, this Imtiaz asks, how does writing about Muslims, money, modern immorality, of profitability, and marketability of identity play in the book?
Well, it's interesting, this sort of idea of the marketability of identity. I think that, in a way, the book is an attempt to confront or come to terms with the fact that I can't ever seem to not be Muslim for non-Muslims, and I'm not Muslim for Muslims. Mm-hmm. And I just want to write about love and death and money and murder and greed, and I just want to write about the human experience. Mm-hmm. So in a way, the book is an attempt to write about the human experience, the American experience, but it's always accounting for the fact that the reader is going to be thinking, well, this Muslim guy is saying these things, or this, and that's really, my career is predicated on that. So there is a marketability to, I often say I only have a career because I've been misinterpreted as positively as I have been. People really knew what I was up to, I probably wouldn't even have a career.
Meaning what? Tell us more about what you're...
Well, for example, with Disgraced, I think that there's this sense that Disgraced, whether if you're Muslim, that Disgraced is somehow about selling my people, if you will, up the river in order to make a profit, and to non-Muslims that somehow I'm writing about how hard it is to be Muslim in America, right? When in fact, it seems to me that Disgraced is about a man who thinks that he thinks he can make his own identity, that he can fashion his own being in America. He can be whoever he wants, but in fact, America won't let him do that. And so it's a story of a person who's confused the false self for the true self, a Don Draper story, if you will, right? That to me, that was the thing that I was paying attention to. And yeah, of course, the specifics, the particularities, they come from my life. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that has to do with Islam. And then there's a supervening layer, which is about the politics of being Muslim post 9/11. But at the end of the day, I'm not writing a play to show people how hard it is to be Muslim post 9/11. And I'm also not writing a play that's about attacking Islam.
Well, one of the themes that runs through Disgraced and also in this book is about sometimes the energy, this sort of latent energy between what we represent of ourselves or what people see of us, whether or not we want them to see that, and what happens when that collapses. Yeah. Either because we sort of tear that away, yeah, or because it is torn away. And
that's an eternal theme. Mm-hmm. It's, and so I think that the particularity, what's that?
It's Othello. I mean, you can go back and, yes, and go back to the great. Anyway, go on. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay. I think a lot of times I get the sense, and I got no problem. I got a career. In fact, I'm talking to Evan Osnos at Politics and Prose. Everything's good. There's no problems. But I think sometimes there's a sense that perhaps I'm writing from the particular to the particular, rather than from the particular to the universal.
I'm going to disagree with you. This is actually writing to the universal. I mean,
I hope so. That's the attempt. That's the attempt.
It is. I mean, that's what, I think what you've done here, which is so hard to do, is to figure out how to take these multiple strands and to have them coexist without coming to some pat sort of unified theory of America's crisis. I think you have a chemistry metaphor in the book about things that exist in solution but don't actually interact.
Yeah, buffer solution. Yeah.
That's more or less the book. I mean, these things are coexisting in ways that actually explain where we are. We have another question here from a member of the audience. Ricky Brody says, I would assume that the book was finished before the pandemic and the big thrust of BLM. Would you have added or changed anything if you were still writing?
Great question. Probably not. I think that what the pandemic has revealed is what has been going on in the country for a while. And, the third section of the book is called Pax Americana, and it really uses affliction as a metaphor. And I think that if I had introduced an actual affliction in the social body, it might have been just a bridge too far. I might have just pushed the metaphor a little too far. So, yeah.
Well, in a way, though, I mean, one of the things that you're describing here is how things that might appear to be artifacts of the moment are in fact symptoms of deeper.
You're right.
I mean, Trump as a symptom of these underlying ailments to the American system, yeah. And clearly, protests about racial injustice and the pandemic are responding to these underlying ailments in the American system. So we have a few more minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to do one more reading.
Yeah.
I want to give people another feel for the language on the page.
Yeah.
And I will also just give a plug. I've heard you read a bit before. Some people won't know that you're actually an actor. You have been in, you've actually worked. I think it was, I saw the movie.
I was in Too Big to Fail. I played Neil Kashkari in Too Big to Fail.
Too Big to Fail, exactly. Another financial theme, I will point out.
Yeah.
So the audiobook is better than most audiobooks. audiobooks, people.
I generally tend to think that the audiobook is probably the best version, or the final version of what it is that I'm doing.
Why is that?
Because so much of it is it's a voice, it's a performance.
Mm-hmm.
And in the nuance on the page, I can't convey the nuance of accent and the nuance of, you know, sometimes the way a line is spoken by an actor or character. It just conveys something you can't explain by saying, you know, having the line of dialogue and then explaining what the underlying subtext is. It just, you can't get that nuance across in the same way.
Do you actually read your work to anybody before you publish?
Yeah, for sure.
You do that routinely. I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah. There was a few different people I was reading sections of this book regularly to.
One other process question before we get to this last reading. I think I read somewhere that you have note cards that you put out, and this is one of the ways that you sort of mentally organize.
Yeah.
How do people think through, how do you organize a project? I mean, you do have an outline essentially up on your wall, and that guides you?
So with this book, it was different than usual, but usually, yes, that's what I do. I work out a story beginning to end, and I put it up on the wall, and then I can start moving stuff around and I can see it. So wall space is very important. But with this book, what I did was, I remember reading that Nabokov had a technique late in his life where he was writing sentences down on note cards. And then he would just put the note cards into a shoebox and then later arrange them in order. So I found myself having all kinds of very disparate ideas about things. I would write them down on note cards and I just keep them in a pile. And then I would, as I was writing, have the note cards out before me and begin working through different stuff. And often by chance, whatever came up, first, I would then begin to work into that. That would lead to something else and lead to something else. And it's like in a way, it's like the cover of the book with the root system. That everything is connected, but they're all kind of, you know, emerging from each other, if you will.
And people will be curious about the title. The Homeland, there are multiple homelands in this book. How do you think about that?
Well, my parents' homeland, what they call back home. It's an elegy for the passing of that idea of home for them, but also for the narrator who's never known that as a home. The homeland, of course, the subliminal homeland security, homeland insecurity, homeland as, you know, as a trope for a kind of patriotic notion of what a country is. And then an elegy really for our country. And what's happened, because I do see us losing something, and I wanted to sing to that loss.
That's a perfect setup for what I think you're going to read now, which is the last page of the book in which you reflect a bit on the notion of home.
So I'm at an event at a college. A mentor who's a kind of Virgil figure throughout the book for me and for the reader has invited me to a college in Iowa to give a talk. And at the end of the talk, which is mostly about capitalism and difficulties in America, there's a Q&A at the end of the talk, just like the Q&A we had here, although it was in person in the book. And so this is what I say. During the Q&A that followed, an older white man stood up in the back row and explained that he'd come to the event having heard something about me on the radio. He'd expected to hear what he hoped would help him make better sense of the seemingly endless problems in the Muslim world. But here he was, and all he'd heard was a lot of criticism of America. I mean, if you don't like it here, he said, I really don't understand why you don't just leave. There was sudden jeering from the students in the front row. I stopped them. The gentleman is free to ask a question. I'm free to give him an answer. I looked back at him. Where exactly, sir, were you thinking that I might go instead? That part's not my problem. I'm just saying I don't get why you're here if you think it's so darn hard. He sat down and waited for me to respond. It took me a moment to speak. I didn't expect to be emotional, but I was. I saw Mary watching me. Mary's the teacher who's invited me. Love in her eyes. When I finally spoke, my voice was unsteady. I'm here because I was born and raised here. This is where I've lived my whole life. For better, for worse, and it's always a bit of both. I don't want to be anywhere else. I've never even thought about it. America's my home.
Well, I think in a perfect world, we would end there because that's an elegant conclusion to our conversation. But there is one more question from a questioner in the audience. And so
okay.
If you can stay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Siddhartha Banerjee asks, who are some of the other writers who write on some of the same things that you do, same themes that
Philip Roth.
Very much so.
Yeah.
There's Portnoy in there. I saw him in there.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. Pilfering the best moment of Portnoy, but also, I mean, the trilogy, the American trilogy, which, you know, is an inspiration to me. It's, I think, par excellence, the best treatment of the formation of the American self from the society of the American society, that interweave between society and selfhood. And I think in a way, this book is an attempt to sort of draw out the selfhood that has emerged from 9/11 and what country we are in, and why the 9/11 period, we may look back and understand that really was a marker for this country's history, and that what we're dealing with now may have more to do with the trauma and the unresolved nature of that trauma than we understand.
You know, your parents, in your real life parents have passed away. They would not have been able to read this book. Have you thought about what you think they would have made of this book?
I think if my mom was still alive, I couldn't have written it. My dad was alive during it, and when I wrote my first book, which featured a father that was very much like my father, and I gave it to my dad, and he opened it, maybe read 2 or 3 sentences and put it down, and it was on his nightstand for 7 years untouched. He didn't like reading very much, even though he was an academic cardiologist, but he still didn't like reading. So I didn't think he would read it anyway, but once he passed away, yeah, I hope they would understand why I wrote what I wrote, because I do bring a bit of, I don't know, disgrace is maybe not the right word, but something, I bring some sort of a thing on the family in a way, and on myself, because I think we have to I felt that I needed to implicate myself in what has come of our country.
And, I mean, as a reader, this book is an act of love by dignifying the complexity of their story and not rendering it as two-dimensional.
Oh, so, thank you for saying that, Evan.
Yeah, this is so much fun.
Thank you so much.
Tonight, I want to remind everybody out there, please buy this wonderful book and buy it from Politics and Prose. And I'll look forward to doing this in person again soon.
Thank you so much. Great.
All right. Sean, over to you. If we're done, we're done. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Evan, thank you so much.